Sis, you stole my groom!
The white shroud. She dressed for a wedding. She arrived at a funeral. The morning smelled of lilies and something else, something colder beneath the sweetness, though Elara Westbrook could not have named it yet. She stepped down from her hired carriage with careful hands, smoothing the gold embroidery at her sleeves, the work that had taken her mother's seamstress 6 long weeks to finish. The gown had been tried on once before, in a candlelit fitting room, and she had cried then because she was so entirely happy. She had not known she would cry again today. She had not known what today would ask of her. The cathedral steps were already full of guests, and that was her first clue. They should have been seated inside, waiting for the music. Instead, they stood in loose clusters on the gray stone, their faces turned outward, arranged into expressions she could not yet read. Curiosity, pity, and the particular sharp alertness of people who sense they are about to witness something they will be retelling at dinner tables for years. She saw the bridal carriage first. It was already at the foot of the steps, its door open, the footman standing aside. And then she saw the woman stepping out of it. The veil, the orange blossoms, the ivory silk that had been cut and fitted to a body identical to Elara's own in every measurement but one. Motive. The woman turned, and Elara looked into the face of her sister. Deloris Westbrook stood on the cathedral steps in Elara's wedding dress, on Elara's wedding morning, holding the arm of the man Elara had agreed to spend her life beside. Geoffrey Holt, who had proposed beneath the oak tree in her mother's garden, who had pressed his family ring into her palm and sworn it was the first of a lifetime of mornings, had his hand at Deloris's waist. He did not look at Elara. That, perhaps, was the cruelest detail. Not the theft, not the dress, the fact that he could not bring himself to look. There is a kind of pain that does not arrive with shattering or noise. It settles. It finds the place behind your sternum where hope has been quietly living, and it simply occupies that space instead, cold and permanent as stone moving into water. Elara felt it arrive and did not move. She stood at the bottom of the steps and understood, completely, what had been done to her, and by whom, and for how long it must have been in the planning. Elara. Deloris's voice was honey poured over glass. I didn't think you'd come. How brave of you. The words landed exactly as designed. Not quite an insult, close enough to wound, calibrated so the crowd could interpret it either way. 200 pairs of eyes swung toward Elara like a single instrument finding its target. She felt them cataloging everything. The set of her jaw, the white gown that made her a mirror image of the woman who had already won, the tremor she was refusing to allow anywhere near her face. I would not have missed it for anything in the world, Deloris. Her voice came out level. She was distantly proud of that. You look exactly as I should have expected. Deloris's smile held. Her eyes went flat. Elara's fingers found the wired stems of her bouquet and tightened until the metal cut into her palm. The small, clean sting was something solid, something real to hold while everything else slipped away. She breathed against it. She kept her chin level, and her eyes open, and her face arranged into the expression of a woman who had not just had her life removed from beneath her feet. She was still standing. For now, that was enough. The shadow's hand. He came out of a black carriage like a verdict. She had never been so glad of one. The murmur had been building for nearly a minute, the low, ugly sound of a crowd that has decided what it is watching and is settling in to enjoy it. When the sound arrived, that changed everything. Not a voice, not a shout. Iron wheels on wet cobblestone. A deep, rolling percussion that seemed to come from the ground itself, made by something heavier and more deliberate than the carriages already lining the street. Every head turned. The horses were enormous and dark, stamping white breath into the gray morning air. And on the door of the black carriage they drew to a halt, catching the flat light like a blade catching sun. A broken crown above 2 crossed swords. The murmuring stopped. It stopped the way all sound stops when something arrives that outranks it. The carriage door opened. A black-gloved hand appeared on the frame. And then Ricardo, Duke of Ashenmoor, stepped down onto the cobblestones. And the morning was not the same morning it had been a moment before. He was not a man you described as handsome. Handsome implied a kind of softness and accessibility, the suggestion that you might approach. He was something else entirely, carved and angular, dark-haired, with a jaw like the architecture of old buildings that have survived things lesser structures have not, and eyes the color of winter sky in the last moment before it decides to snow. His coat was so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it, rather than reflect it. His gloves were the blackest things Elara had ever seen against the pale morning. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at Deloris in her stolen gown, or at Geoffrey frozen beside the altar steps. He looked directly at Elara, with the directness of a man who has decided something and sees no particular reason to announce it before acting on it. Then he walked toward her, and the crowd parted the way water parts for stone, because there is simply no other available option. Miss Westbrook. His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who never needed to raise it. I must beg your forgiveness. The roads from Ashenmoor were treacherous this morning, and I have kept you waiting. He extended his black-gloved hand as though he had been expected, as though this moment had been arranged between them long before either of them had arrived at it. Elara stared at the outstretched hand and searched her memory for whatever she had missed. She had exchanged perhaps a dozen pleasantries with the Duke of Ashenmoor across 2 seasons. Carefully polite nothings at the edges of other people's ballrooms, the kind of exchange that leaves no trace. He had no reason to be here. He had no reason to be looking at her as though she were the only fixed point in a world coming apart at its seams. Your Grace, she said quietly. I fear there has been some confusion. None on my part. He raised his voice then. Just enough, just the precise amount required. The cathedral steps went absolutely silent. Even the birds stopped. Even the bells. I offer you my name and my title, and the full protection of my house. I have secured a special license. I have the means and the standing to ensure that nothing that has occurred on these steps today holds the power to diminish you. In any court, any drawing room, any conversation in this kingdom. Ever. I ask only your answer. Here. Now. Before these witnesses, 200 faces had gone to stone. Elara could feel Deloris' stillness behind her like a held breath. The stillness of someone whose play has just had its ending rewritten in front of the entire audience. She did not look at her sister. She did not look at Geoffrey, who had gone the color of old wax and was opening and closing his mouth with nothing inside it. She looked at the Duke, at the steady winter gray of his eyes. The only thing in the whole gray morning that was not moving. Yes. Her voice came out clear. It carried. Yes, Your Grace. I accept. The collective inhale of 200 people was audible as wind through a door left open. Deloris made a sound, sharp, involuntary, the sound of a woman who has just watched her victory dissolve mid-celebration. Geoffrey's face cycled from ash to crimson and found nothing useful at either end. He opened his mouth. He had nothing. He closed it again. The Duke's hand settled at the small of Elara's back. Firm. Warm. Not a suggestion. A fact, stated plainly, in front of everyone. He turned her toward the cathedral doors and the crowd gave way before them, and Elara kept her eyes forward, and her chin level, and her shoulders square, and did not look back. Not at Deloris, not at Geoffrey, not at any of the 200 faces that had come prepared to watch her break. She was not breaking. She was not the same woman she had been 10 minutes ago either. She did not yet know what she was, but she walked through those doors, and the heavy wood closed behind her. And whatever she was becoming, it had already begun. Entering the monster's den, the house was dark. The man who lived in it was darker. But not in the way she had been told. The ceremony in the cathedral vestry had lasted 11 minutes. Elara had counted. The vicar, Reverend Aldous, had been visibly shaking, whether from cold or the weight of the occasion she could not determine. And the vows had been ancient and plain, and she had spoken them in a voice that surprised her with its steadiness. When the Duke slid the Ashenmoor signet ring onto her finger, 2 large, heavy gold, the broken crown pressed into the metal, he had pushed it firmly into place with a quiet finality that felt, against all reason, like the closing of a lock she had not known was open. He had kissed her hand, not her lips, his mouth against her gloved knuckles for exactly as long as courtesy required. And then he had offered his arm and led her back out into the light. Now they sat across from each other in the black carriage, heading north, and the silence between them was the kind that held whole conversations it had not yet found the words for. The English countryside moved past the windows in shades of gray, fields, hedgerows, the occasional farmhouse retreating into distance, and Elara watched it go and thought about the ring on her finger, too large, pressing cold against her knuckle, impossible to ignore. You should know, she said at last. I will not be a problem for you, Your Grace. I expect very little, and am accustomed to managing my own affairs. I ask only to under Ashenmoor, house emerged from the moor the way old grief emerges. Without announcement, without apology, occupying its full proportion of sky and stone, as though the landscape had simply arranged itself around it. The gates were iron and flanked by carved ravens whose spread wings faced permanently outward, as though standing guard against something that had been coming for a very long time. The grounds were immaculate and severe. No flowers, no softness, only the hard geometry of dark topiary and the distant wall of woodland that seemed to begin precisely where the rest of the world ended. Elara pressed closer to the carriage glass and looked, and did not pretend, even to herself, that she was not unsettled. It is very large, she said, barely above a breath. Yes, without apology. But she felt his attention on her face. Inside, the entrance hall was everything the exterior had promised. Stone floors worn smooth by 2 centuries of footfall, high ceilings, dark portraits of ancestors who did not appear to have enjoyed themselves at any point during their lives, and cold light pressing through tall, narrow windows, as though even the light had been rationed here. The housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway, iron-spined, 60s, the particular stillness of a woman who has watched this house through worse, stood at the head of the assembled staff and measured Elara with a careful, unhurried assessment that withheld its verdict entirely. "Tand what you require of me." "I require very little," he said. "That you carry the title with the dignity I have already seen you possess. The rest we shall determine as circumstances require." He turned to the window. Something moved in the line of his jaw. Not warmth, but the absence of warmth, noticed. "You should prepare yourself. Ashenmoor House is not comfortable in the way that other houses are comfortable. I have not lived a particularly comfortable life, Your Grace." She kept her eyes on the passing fields. "I don't expect I shall miss it greatly." He turned back. He studied her with the attention of a man who has learned to read things quickly and carefully. And something shifted, very briefly, behind his eyes. And then it was gone, and he returned to the window, and they rode the rest of the way in a silence that was, if not warm, at least no longer entirely cold. Elara was cataloguing all of this, the severity, the chill, the unsmiling portraits, when her eye snagged on something at the far end of the hall. A door, half open, and through it, the unmistakable spine of a book catching the lamplight. Then another. Then the particular quality of air that belongs only to rooms that hold very many of them. "Is that a library?" she said, turning to him. "Yes." A pause. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the first movement of muscles that had clearly not been asked to perform one in some time. 3,000 volumes. You are welcome to all of them. Perhaps the monster and the man were not the same thing. Perhaps she had simply not yet seen enough to know which one she had married. She picked up her skirts and followed Mrs. Calloway up the staircase, and noted, as she went, that every landing had a bookshelf. She began, very quietly, to revise her expectations. The Duke's scars. She had heard the stories about his face. She was not prepared for the truth about his heart. She had been at Ashenmoor House for 14 days and had learned the following things about her husband. He rose before dawn, ate breakfast alone, managed his estate with an efficiency that bordered on severity, did not require her presence at dinner, but always arrived at the table in time for it, never spoke more than was necessary, and, most unexpectedly, read for exactly 1 hour every night in the library, in the chair closest to the fire, with his coat removed and his guard fractionally, almost imperceptibly lowered. It was the lowered guard that brought her to the doorway. She had not been able to sleep. The house had a way of being loudly silent, full of the kind of quiet that presses, and she had taken her candle and walked the dark corridors without any particular destination until the thin line of firelight beneath the library door stopped her. She stood there a moment. Then she looked. The scar ran from below his left ear, along the edge of his jaw, pale silver against the rest of him, disappearing beneath his open collar. It was old and clean and deliberate. The kind of line that does not come from a fall or a riding accident, or any of the explanations offered in polite company. Someone had put it there on purpose. This was a message written in another man's handwriting on his skin, and whoever had written it had taken their time. "I know you are there, Miss Westbrook." He did not look up from his book. "You may come in or go back to bed. Standing in doorways does neither of us any good." She went in. She sat in the other chair, on the far side of the fire, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The flames were the loudest thing in the room. "The scar," she said. It was not an accident. Not a question. His book did not close, but the quality of his stillness changed. The stillness of a man who has heard a thing said aloud that he had grown accustomed to no one saying. "No." "Who?" The fire held the silence for him. When he finally answered, his voice was level, in the way that things are level when they have been made level through long effort rather than easy temperament. "A cousin. We were close, once. As close as two young men can be when one of them has already decided the other is an obstacle rather than a person." A pause. "He believed my title ought to have been his. What happened to him? He is alive. He is in the north. We have an arrangement by which the north is sufficiently far away." They stayed until the fire died down to embers, talking in the way that people talk when neither of them expected to, and both of them needed to. She asked questions she had not known she had. He answered with the measured precision of a man unaccustomed to being asked, but not, she slowly understood, entirely averse to it. She learned that the reputation, the monster duke, the scarred tyrant, the name the ton deployed like a warning at supper tables, had not been built by Wayne Ricardo. It had been built by the people who feared him, because fear, he told her with the flat authority of long experience, was the only wall that certain kinds of people would ever actually respect. She did not tell him that this, of all the things she had learned about Ashenmoor House, was the most dangerous knowledge to be carrying. "The stories about this house and its master," he said at last, returning to his book. "I have not corrected them. I know. And you are not afraid." "Not quite a question." She met his eyes across the dying fire. "I was afraid of my sister," she said, "and she still destroyed me. I find I have recalibrated my sense of what constitutes danger." Wayne Ricardo studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he turned back to his book. But the line of his shoulders had changed. Something in him had settled. Some held thing, set down. She noticed it the way you notice a sound stopping, in the new quality of the quiet it left behind. She said nothing. She opened her own book. The fire burned down to its last orange pulse, and they read together in the dark. And the house was still. And it was the most peaceful Elara had felt since a morning that felt like a different life entirely. The first spark. She had spent her whole life making herself smaller. The monster Duke watched her stop. The Fairfaxes were the first guests Elara had hosted as Duchess of Ashenmoor, and she had prepared with the thoroughness of a woman who understands that first impressions in a house like this are not easily revised. She had overseen the menu with Mrs. Calloway, arranged the flowers herself, chosen a gown in deep blue that was formal enough to signal she understood the weight of what she was now carrying. She sat at the far end of the long dining table from Wayne and thought, "This is a test of something," and she intended to pass it. The dinner proceeded with the careful pleasantness of people who do not know each other well enough to be honest. The claret was good, the pheasant better, and Lord Fairfax, 50-something, with a mouth that had clearly never been told no by anyone he respected, was on his third glass when he decided that careful pleasantness was beneath him. "I was surprised to hear of Ashenmoor's acquisition," he said, in the tone of a man making an observation that was not quite an observation. One expected the Duke to choose rather more deliberately when the time came. The table went careful. At the far end, Wayne's expression did not change, but his hand on the stem of his glass went still. Indeed, his son Henry, 30s, with his father's contempt, and none of the years to have earned it, offered a smirk across the table. One hears the lady was available through rather unfortunate circumstances. The old Elara, the one who had spent 24 years learning to absorb cruelty and smile through it, to look at her plate, to wait for the discomfort to pass, would have looked at her plate. This Elara looked directly at Henry Fairfax. "How curious," she said. Her voice came out clear and unhurried, the voice of a woman who has decided she is allowed to use it. "The circumstances I recall are that the Duke of Ashenmoor chose, of his own will, in front of 200 witnesses, to extend an offer that any woman of sense would have accepted. As for deliberation, I find that men of genuine quality rarely require very long to recognize it in others." The silence was immediate and total. Henry Fairfax's smirk did not so much disappear as simply cease to exist, like a candle that has been cupped. Lord Fairfax's glass stopped halfway to his mouth and stayed there. Lady Fairfax became very interested in her pheasant. Elara felt rather than saw Wayne turn to look at her from the other end of the table. She did not look back. She reached for her wine with a steadiness she was quietly proud of and waited. "My wife has, I find, an admirable precision of expression." Wayne's voice was level and carried the length of the table without effort. "I recommend attending to it." The dinner recovered in the way that things recover when the people involved have too much pride and too much social training to allow a collapse. Carefully, incrementally, with the Fairfaxes discovering their manners when they realized they had badly miscalculated the quality of their opposition. By the time the port was poured, the whole evening might almost have seemed, to an outside observer, entirely unremarkable. Elara moved through the rest of it with the particular quiet fire of a woman who has discovered, late and unexpectedly, that she has a voice worth using, and that someone across a long dining table had, it seemed, been listening for it. In the entrance hall after the guests had gone, the house settling back into its nighttime silence around them, Wayne turned to her. "The Fairfaxes have not been spoken to in that manner in living memory. They will recover." "Yes, they will." A pause. Something in his expression was different from anything she had catalogued before. Not the careful neutrality, not the studied distance. Something had moved in him, and he had not, this time, moved it back. "Thank you for that." It cost him something to say it. She could tell by the way he said it. The small, precise effort in those last two words, as though each one had to be chosen and set down deliberately, like something fragile carried across a room. She did not make it larger than it was. "Good night, Your Grace." She went up the stairs with her candle and did not look back. Behind her, at the bottom of the staircase, the Duke of Ashenmoor stood in the dark of his own entrance hall, and did not move for a long time after the light disappeared. Deloris's envy. She had stolen a man. She had not understood until now what she had failed to steal. Elara had known they would come. It was inevitable. Deloris had never, in 24 years of shared existence, been able to resist confirming the effect of her cruelties. She would need to see the damage, to verify with her own eyes that Elara was diminished, cold, trapped, quietly miserable in the Gothic grandeur of the monster's house, in the loveless contract Deloris had arranged for her. She had not, Elara suspected, accounted for the possibility that the cage was not a cage. They arrived on a Wednesday. Geoffrey looked like a man who had recently had occasion to review the terms of a bargain he had made and found them rather worse on reading. Deloris wore a gown that was expensive and did not suit her, mauve, a color for a softer complexion, and she came into the drawing room with her chin slightly elevated and her eyes moving over everything with the particular attention of a woman searching for evidence of unhappiness. "How Gothic," she said, turning in a slow half-circle. "It must take an enormous effort of will not to find it oppressive, darling." "I find it suits me perfectly," Elara said. "Sit down, Deloris. Mrs. Calloway will bring tea." Wayne came in perhaps 5 minutes later, without announcement and without ceremony, and moved to Elara's side and stood there. Not performing, not arranging himself for an audience or placing a demonstrative hand anywhere a crowd might note and report. Simply present. Near, as though this was, without discussion or deliberation, where he stood now. "Mrs. Holt." His voice was neutral and courteous, and offered nothing beyond what it said. "I hope the journey was not too disagreeable." His hand rested on the back of Elara's chair, not on her shoulder. Just there, behind her, a quiet proximity that stated its case without argument. Deloris's eyes went to the hand and stayed a moment too long. "We managed perfectly well. Geoffrey was saying that your northern roads are in want of repair. I'll have my estate manager look into it." He turned slightly toward Elara. "Your garden committee sent word this morning. The proposal for the south wing has been approved." "Wonderful. I wanted to show you the drawings before I confirmed the planting. Will you have time this afternoon?" "After 4, yes." It was entirely ordinary, entirely domestic. A small exchange about a garden, conducted between two people who had apparently developed, without fanfare, the habit of talking to each other. To Deloris, watching from across the tea table with a smile she had arrived expecting to be triumphant, it was absolutely catastrophic, because they were not performing for her. That was the thing she had not planned for and could not now account for. They were simply existing, in the natural, unhurried proximity of two people who have begun to occupy the same space by preference rather than obligation. Wayne brought Elara her tea the way she took it, without being asked. Elara mentioned something he had said at breakfast, as naturally as breathing. There was, beneath the formality they still wore with each other like a garment not yet quite broken in, the first unmistakable filament of something that no forged letter and no stolen wedding could have manufactured. Deloris watched it, and could not name what she felt, because what she felt was not quite envy and not quite regret. It was the hollow specific to people who destroy things, at the precise moment they discover what the thing they destroyed was worth. "You seem settled, Elara," she said at last, her voice a degree too bright. "I am relieved." Elara met her eyes across the table. "Yes," she said. "I suppose I am." Deloris smiled. It did not reach anywhere near her eyes. Across the table, Geoffrey studied his teacup, with the focused attention of a man who has run out of anywhere else to look. The visit continued for another 40 minutes out of social obligation, and every one of them cost Deloris something she had not arrived expecting to spend. The letter of lies. She had believed in him. The letter gave her permission to stop. She took it. She was wrong. She had come to his study to return a book she had borrowed, a volume of Milton he had recommended one evening in the library 3 weeks ago, and which she had finally finished. The room was empty, the desk strewn with the usual estate correspondence, and she was halfway to the shelf when she saw the paper on the floor. It must have slipped from the stack and fallen. She bent to retrieve it without thinking. The handwriting stopped her before the words did. Deloris's copperplate, the careful, elegant script their mother had insisted on, drilled into them both through a decade of childhood lessons. Elara would have known it in the dark. The letter was addressed to a solicitor's office in London. It described, in the flat, mechanical language of business negotiation, a set of arrangements between the Duke of Ashenmoor and an unnamed third party concerning the transfer of northern landholdings, property that had been held in trust by Elara's grandmother and which the Holt family had been attempting to acquire, through one means or another, for 2 generations. The letter referred to Elara herself as the Westbrook complication, and outlined the terms by which her installation as Duchess would facilitate access to what lay, conveniently, behind her name. She was an instrument, a key to a door someone else wanted opened. She read it twice. The second time did not improve it. Then she set it back on the desk with the kind of care you use when handling something that might shatter if you are not extremely gentle with it, and she walked to her rooms and sat at the window and did not move for what might have been an hour or might have been longer. The moors stretched gray and uninterrupted to the horizon, and she watched them and thought about how she had told herself, when she accepted Wayne's proposal on those cathedral steps, that she understood what this was. A transaction. Equal terms. an arrangement that served them both and required nothing of either beyond what had been explicitly stated. She had believed, honest with herself about that, clear-eyed, unsentimental. But somewhere between the midnight library and the dinner with the Fairfaxes, and the afternoons discussing garden drawings with his hand resting, unthinking, on the back of her chair, somewhere in all of that she had stopped keeping the account. She had let herself believe that what was growing between them was real. And now there was a letter, in Deloris's hand, suggesting otherwise. The knock on her door came perhaps an hour later. Wayne entered without waiting for an answer. He never did, she realized, when something was wrong, and looked at her face and went entirely still. What has happened? She handed him the letter without a word. He read it. His expression did not change, but his jaw tightened once in the way it tightened when something cost him, and she knew, distantly, beneath the numbness, that he knew what it said before he finished reading it. "I would like to know," she said, her voice more controlled than she felt, "if it is true." He was quiet for a long moment. "The land holdings matter to the Holt family. That much is true. The letter is not. It is in Deloris's hand." "Yes, she has been thorough." Wayne, his name, said aloud, for the first time. It fell between them, like something dropped from a great height. "Is it true?" He looked at her then, directly, without the careful neutrality he wore for everyone else, and she saw in his face something she had not expected. Not guilt, weariness, the exhaustion of a man who has spent a great deal of effort building something and has just watched it begin to crack. "No," he said quietly. "But I understand why you cannot simply take my word for it." He set the letter on the table between them. He left the room without another word, and the door closed behind him with a softness that was somehow worse than if he had slammed it. Elara sat with the moors and the gray light in the cracked open space where certainty used to live, and tried to decide what she knew versus what she was afraid of, and found that she could not tell the difference. The Winter Gala. Deloris built her trap in public. Wayne had been dismantling it in private for months. The ballroom was everything that power and wealth could arrange to look like beauty. 1,000 candles in 6 chandeliers, flowers brought in from greenhouses at impossible expense, 200 of the finest names from 2 counties assembled in silk and diamonds, and the particular sharp-eyed alertness of high society when it senses the possibility of an exceptionally good scandal. They had all heard, of course. Versions of the forged letter had been circulating through drawing rooms for a fortnight. Deloris had made certain of that, and the whispers had built like pressure before a storm. Elara entered on Wayne's arm and felt the room turn to assess her. There was a distance between them that had not been there 3 weeks ago, and every eye sharp enough to notice had noticed. She kept her face arranged into the expression of a woman who was not, currently, being measured for her collapse, and moved through the crowd with her spine straight and her hand steady on his sleeve. Deloris was near the center of the room, which was of course where she would be. She approached with Geoffrey trailing behind her like luggage, and her smile had the particular sharpened quality it always took on when she believed she had won something. "How wonderful you could both attend," she said, her voice pitched to carry to the knot of guests already gathering. "I had half expected, given the circumstances, that you might prefer a quieter season." Lady Ashford, who had never met a piece of gossip she did not immediately adopt, leaned in with the expression of a woman settling in for a show. "Indeed, one has heard various things." The circle tightened. Deloris's smile widened. This was the moment she had engineered. The public execution, conducted in a ballroom with 200 witnesses. "I only hope, dear Elara, that you have not found the arrangement unsatisfying. Given that one now understands it was made for rather more practical reasons than initially supposed." The room held its breath. Every conversation within earshot had stopped. Even the musicians seemed to pause mid-phrase. Then Wayne Ricardo spoke. "I owe the assembled company a correction of some recent misinformation." His voice was calm and level, and carried to every corner of the ballroom without effort. He did not raise it. He never needed to. Every head turned. "A letter purporting to document the terms of my marriage has been in circulation for some weeks. I have had it examined by 3 separate solicitors, and by the Metropolitan Police. It is a forgery. The hand belongs to Mrs. Geoffrey Holt, formerly Miss Deloris Westbrook. This is documented. The documentation is available to anyone who wishes to review it." The silence was immediate and absolute. Even the candles seemed to stop flickering. "Furthermore," he continued, in the same measured tone, "Mrs. Holt engineered the substitution of herself for my wife at the altar 7 months ago by intercepting and altering wedding correspondence over a period of 4 months. She arranged for Miss Westbrook to be misdirected on the morning of the ceremony. She substituted herself in the bridal preparations the evening prior. I have sworn testimony from 3 members of household staff, a modiste, and a coachman. The matter is being addressed through the appropriate legal channels." Elara watched Deloris's face do something she had never seen it do in all their years of shared childhood. It went entirely still. Every practiced expression stripped away, leaving only the pale shock underneath, the face of a woman who has just discovered that the trap she built has closed on her instead. My wife, Wayne said, turning slightly toward Elara, is the Duchess of Ashenmoor. She has been, and will continue to be, the only woman in this kingdom to hold that title. I trust that resolves any outstanding confusion. He extended his hand. Elara placed her fingers in his, steady now, not trembling, and he led her onto the floor as the first movement of a waltz began. 200 people who had come expecting to witness a duchess destroyed, watched instead as she rose, unambiguously, magnificently, and entirely beyond their ability to touch. Deloris left within the quarter hour. Geoffrey went with her. No one remarked on their departure. The monster and the queen. He removed his armor. She found, beneath it, the only home she had ever believed in. Snow had come to Ashenmoor. Not the driving, punishing kind, but the soft sort that falls without hurry and settles on everything like a held breath made visible. Elara walked the garden path she had been designing since autumn, now buried under the first proper snowfall, and did not mind that her careful plans were hidden. They would still be there in the spring. Some things could afford to wait. She had known Wayne would find her. He always did now. This had become one of the quiet facts of their life together, the kind that accumulates without ceremony and becomes, before you notice it happening, the architecture of something you depend on. He came to stand beside her on the white path, his dark coat sharp against the snow, and they looked out at what the garden would be when the world thawed, and the snow fell between them, and neither of them spoke for a long time. "I owe you an accounting," he said at last. "You gave me one. At the gala. That was a public accounting. I owe you a private one." He was quiet, working towards something. She waited, the way she had learned to wait for him, not with impatience, but with the steady attention of someone who knows that what is being built is worth the time it takes. "I have known who you were for 2 years," he said, "before the cathedral, before any of it. I had watched you at the assemblies, managing your sister's cruelties with a grace I had never seen performed for so little acknowledgement. I had considered introducing myself a dozen times. I found reasons not to." "What reasons?" The snow fell. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Then, men with my reputation do not approach women like you. Women who are quiet and composed and carrying more than anyone around them can see. They deserve something I was not certain I had." "And now?" she asked softly. He turned to face her fully, and she saw what she had been trying not to name for months, that the winter-gray eyes were not cold and had never been cold. They had only ever been careful, the carefulness of a man who had learned, at considerable cost, to guard what mattered. "Now I am certain I have nothing adequate to offer you," he said, "and I find I am going to offer it anyway." A pause, shorter. "I would burn the world to the ground before I allowed it to touch you. I am aware that is not a comfortable thing to say." "No," she said, very quietly. "Don't burn it. No, I want to live in it. With you. I would prefer it intact." Something in his expression broke open. Not dramatically, not with any of the grand gestures the story had already spent its share of, but simply, a man who has been holding something for a very long time, and is finally, carefully, setting it down. He took her hand, the same black-gloved hand he had extended to her on the cathedral steps, in what felt now like another lifetime. She took it, as she had then, as she would again and again for as long as he offered it. Behind them, Ashenmoor House stood dark and unyielding against the white sky, all stone and narrow windows, and the particular severity of a place that has never softened itself for anyone. But through the library window, if you looked, you could see the warm glow of a fire already laid, and 2 chairs waiting, and the particular quality of light that belongs to rooms where people have learned to be still together. The Duchess of Ashenmoor was no longer the woman who had arrived at a wedding in a white dress and found her life stolen out from under her. She was a woman who had survived betrayal, walked into a fortress, defended the man inside it, and discovered, slowly, with difficulty, through more than anyone should have been asked to carry, that she had never needed rescuing. What she had needed was the space to find out what she was made of. She had found it. She was home. Thank you for watching Midnight Stories. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you get notified as soon as we drop a new story.